Gillian Flynn's novel Gone Girl tells the story of a dysfunctional marriage that escalates into a twisted game of catch-up between the two spouses and protagonists of the book. Nick and Amy Dunn, both previously successful, now failed writers, feeling stuck in their lives, have grown apart and resentful towards each other. While Nick attempts to escape his unhappiness through an affair with one of his writing students, Amy resorts to meticulously planning and executing her own disappearance and framing her husband for his supposed murder in the process, to get back at him for cheating, but ultimately for not measuring up to her image of him. At its core, Gone Girl is a tale of two unusually narcissistic people caught up in a constant contest with each other, which makes it nearly impossible for them to be happy, both individually and as a couple, but also makes it just as unavoidable for them to eventually stay united in their envious yet admiring contempt for each other. Not only the story's central plotline, but many decisions and developments along the way are dictated by both Amy's and Nick's need to feed their respective egos. This paper will set up a theoretical framework of narcissism's pathology first to illustrate how typical many of the behavioral patterns present in Amy and Nick are, presenting symptoms and sources, after which it will explore the presence of these traits in the named Gone Girl characters. Finally, this will enable an evaluation of the Dunn's relationship, demonstrating its inevitable doom that is, at the same time, the very reason why the two protagonists can't let each other go. This is one of my papers. As an addendum at the beginning of this, since it's been almost 10 years since I wrote this paper, and actually 10 years since I first thought about writing it, I want to quickly remark on the overuse of the term narcissism in recent years, which, funnily enough, came up fairly soon after I first explored this topic for this very paper. We have become very quick to diagnose people generally who we don't really know very well or don't know at all, but have read an account about online, and have all become far too loose with using terminology that we have picked up somewhere and tend to talk about as though we are all suddenly experts in psychology and therapy. While obviously the positive side to that is that we are all much more aware of both ourselves and others, hopefully taking better care of ourselves and those around us, I find it a bit worrying at times that every type of antisocial behavior, no matter how small or how defensive or regardless of the context, is immediately cause for calling people a narcissist. I hope that the differentiations I made in this paper back when I wrote it are sufficient to make clear that there is a big difference between certain character traits that may not be great and deserve exploration and healing, possibly, and a diagnosable disorder. I think this is something we should all keep in mind. I would also be amiss not to mention that I myself am also not a psychologist, and though I have delved into this topic a lot and fairly early and with professional literature by experts, that doesn't make me an expert, and I shall not go beyond diagnosing these two fictional characters. The second point I want to mention is that Gone Girl may be a name that, since the publishing of the movie that was based on the book, that might be the material that a lot of people might be more familiar with than the original source material. And though the movie is very faithful to the book in the things that it does portray, as is the nature of adaptations, particularly from books to movies, there are a lot of things that were cut out, some things that were portrayed a bit differently, yada, yada, yada. My perspective here is focused entirely on the book, though I have used a few clips from the movie to illustrate a few things, or if the exact quote could also be found in the movie, I thought that might be a bit nicer than just having me read everything. Now, with all that being said, let's jump into the pathology of narcissism and narcissistic personality disorder so we have a bit of a basis for what we're talking about. Like most mental illnesses and personality disorders, narcissism exists on a spectrum. So generally, narcissistic personality disorder, or NPD for short, so I don't have to keep repeating it, which is the most pathological stage, the stage that is actually a disorder, is characterized by a pattern of grandiosity and an unusual lack to sometimes even a complete absence of empathy. These two things are accompanied by a hypersensitivity to criticism, a need for being admired, and an incessant urge to be successful in whatever way that might be for the person in question. Most narcissistic traits, however, are present to a much lesser, but some degree, in people on the quote-unquote normal, so neurotypical spectrum, because they are largely ways to regulate self-worth by protecting the ego from mental and emotional harm through insecurity and hurtful experiences, which just means to say that we all are capable of behavior that could be called narcissistic because they are natural responses to certain threats and injuries to our egos and self-worth. This is important because it is only when these traits dominate a personality and overpower empathy for and interest in others consistently for the sake of self-preservation that they become pathological. Even then, opinions on how NPD should be classified and specified vary among experts. The DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, classifies NPD as a so-called cluster B disorder, which are characterized by dramatic, emotional, or erratic aspects, behaviors, symptoms. The ICD-10, which is the International Statistical Classification of Diseases and Related Health Problems, which has also since been replaced by the newest edition, the ICD-11, defines it as a disorder characterized by an enduring pattern of grandiose beliefs and arrogant behavior together with an overwhelming need for admiration and a lack of empathy for and even exploitation of others. And as a personality disorder characterized by excessive self-love, egocentrism, grandiosity, exhibitionism, excessive needs for attention, and sensitivity to criticism. The reference code for this, or the so-called diagnosis code for this, is F60.81. NPD is the most severe form of narcissism, which itself is one form of antisocial personality types and disorders. That is not to say, however, that anything less than the diagnosis of NPD is not socially hindering or a threat to both the afflicted and, especially in the case of narcissism, others. Even more severely antisocial cases than those people diagnosed with NPD are commonly classed as psychopathic personalities. There's also a phenomenon that is categorized as either part of NPD or as a lesser stage of it, called malignant narcissism syndrome. This includes antisocial behavior and paranoid tendencies, but most notably, this syndrome is characterized by aggression aimed at either the self and or others, as well as violent outbursts, both on a mental and emotional and a physical level. This aggression, regardless of whether it is justified or not, and it usually isn't, has to be perceived by the afflicted as part of them and quote-unquote normal, meaning they can't be aware that that is an overreaction or this is not quote-unquote how they usually are, but for them it's a normal response to the things that they perceive as hurtful or demeaning or disrespectful. Beyond that, malignant narcissism, just like NPD, entails the same traits that constitute a narcissistic personality, either at borderline or at neurotic level, which is a distinction I won't explain further, but you're welcome to look at the sources that are on the screen right now if you want to learn more. These traits I will explain in the following, while focusing on aspects that are actually relevant for this paper. They can all mostly be sorted into pairs of outward behavior and inward states of mind that spawn the respective behavior. That does, however, not make an automatic statement on which of these traits the narcissist is aware of. So that means all of the things I'm going to be talking about here do not necessarily need to be things that the narcissist is aware of. It is entirely possible that a narcissist might not be aware of any of these. The first is grandiosity as the behavior that is spawned by self-doubt as an inward state of mind. Grandiosity is commonly described as the defining factor in narcissism. It's also the reason why narcissism is sometimes misunderstood or oversimplified as being legitimately in love with yourself and posting selfies on Instagram, which is not quite what it is, but it's true that grandiosity is mentioned as the main symptom that distinguishes narcissism from borderline personalities. Narcissists commonly dream of limitless success, whatever that means to them, and they feel entitled to special treatment merely for existing or for being who they are. They might justify this, they might not. They can, however, still come off as content and self-sufficient despite maybe feeling this entitlement that is not being fulfilled. Behind that facade, they tend to harbor self-doubt and a constant fear of being inferior or rejected, because that is a void that they cannot fill themselves. That is also a reason why they are quick to feel deeply and personally ashamed or even emotionally empty, making them vulnerable to all, even constructive or completely unreasonable criticism. If you were being sympathetic, you could say they take everything to heart and they have no means of building themselves back up inside. So what they do instead is push it away and try to build walls, which in this case would then be grandiosity. It also leads to the fact that if criticized, they can experience narcissistic injury. That means they see their self-worth being threatened, to which they will usually react with intense so-called narcissistic rage, fear, and feelings of humiliation and rejection, though this reaction is often not expressed openly. So narcissistic rage might be expressed, or it might just exist and be harbored or eat away at the afflicted. Due to this dichotomy, this outwardly very big presence and the inward very, very small person, some divide narcissism into two types, the grandiose and the vulnerable, with the latter being more susceptible to shame and experiencing it outright and putting a lot of pressure on themselves to be perfect or to please in order to get admiration and the short bursts of healing and appeasement that they crave. Despite these two types existing, these are not to be understood as two different diagnoses or two distinct types of disorder. Rather, there is usually a dominant aspect that dictates the narcissist's general behavior depending on certain individual contextual factors. Our second dichotomy is social success as an outward behavior or, circumstance, and boredom as an internal state. Unlike people with disorders and personality types that make the sufferer reclusive, narcissists are usually perceived as alluring and charming social magnets, often inexplicably so. People tend to flock to them. They draw attention. However, their social context usually stays superficial and are kept mostly as a source for the constant admiration that the narcissist hungers for, or tools to reach certain personal goals. Because narcissists don't take any actual interest in other people as individuals, particularly if they are not capable of any empathy at all, they quickly get bored, being unable to truly partake in group activities as well. They therefore frequently change their social environments if possible, and can, for non-suspecting people looking in, just seem like social butterflies who are always busy and always making new friends. Our third dichotomy is idealization and contempt. Narcissists tend to make abrupt mental switches between idealizing people close to them, or rather what they stand for to them, or mean for the narcissist's self-image, because they project a part of themselves onto the people they're quote-unquote close to, or even what the narcissist would like to be, another type of projection. And on the other hand, bottomless contempt for that same person or those same people when they somehow disrupt that image or don't live up to the expectations and the representation that the narcissist had built up for them in their own minds, because that's displeasing and disturbing to the narcissist. This disturbance and displeasure is then often expressed by openly devaluing the other person or spinning intrigues against them somehow. To explain a bit further, the idealization aspect of that is usually based in the conviction that it takes special people to understand the narcissist or to truly be close to the narcissist, turning those close, again, in quotes, people into an extension of the narcissist's ego. Conversely, because of this, because these people are now part of the narcissist's ego/identity, when these same quote-unquote special people express their normalcy by not being perfect in the narcissist's eyes, it means that making any misstep is a personal affront and a confirmation of the often deeply rooted belief in narcissists that no one can be trusted on a fundamental level. In other words, narcissists don't see these offenders as someone that hurt them as much as they consider them a bad reflection on their self-image, which again can spark a lot of rage and a lot of entitlement to a change in behavior because the narcissist sees their way as the only way. Our next aspect is lack of empathy, envy, and below that, maybe a fear of dependence. Because of their intense focus on their self, narcissists are not able to experience true empathy for other people. Likewise, they have a constant fear of depending on others because they do not trust anyone, as mentioned above. This is due to not building any deeper, meaningful relationships and seeing others as less capable than or beneath them. Ironically, because they don't have those close-knit ties with anybody, they might actually be right that they cannot depend on anyone to the most extreme extent, but they are incapable of seeing that that is not so much an expression of everybody wanting to betray them or nobody being dependable under any circumstances, but that their relationships might simply not be strong enough to be loyal in every situation. Especially not, of course, if they're being hurtful or destructive. Part of this internal or external belittlement of others is an intense harboring of envy of others' skills and accomplishments, and a resentment for their ability to make real social connections, none of which is openly expressed usually, but cultivated. A side effect of this, and of point F, let's say, is a tendency to disrespect authority. I'll say more about that in a second. Before that, we have the dichotomy of common relationship troubles and an internal incapability of love, true love. Which means that relationship and marriage troubles are a common occurrence in relationships with narcissists, kind of regardless of what sort of damage or non-damage the other person has, though of course this is particularly hurtful and potentially dangerous to people who are largely normal, or even more so, vulnerable in other ways. Narcissists tend to be successful and greedy in advances. Again, since this is now almost 10 years after writing this paper, a lot of people listening might have heard of the term love bombing before. They are great flirters. They are great in approaching people, coming up with romantic ideas, showering you with compliments, etc., etc. But what people usually don't notice is that they are distant and emotionally cool at the same time, and therefore, first of all, likely to be unfaithful in all senses, and second of all, very likely to grow cold as soon as they feel like they've made the catch or the novelty has worn off. Both of these things grow out of their need for new admiration, for novelty, for another person to feed the ego, and an inability to truly love another person, because how could you when you don't feel empathy, as they fail to see their partners, or anyone else but themselves for that matter, as a complex person with wishes, boundaries, ideals that may differ from their own and that are worth respecting and upholding. At the same time, they do dream of ideal love, like they dream of success and power, as a vague, purely positive concept that is there to serve them, to make them whole, because they are constantly empty and they usually notice, and no relationship could ever measure up to that because it is exclusively attached to their egocentric mental image of it. Likewise, they are capable of abusing and exploiting even supposedly close relationships of any kind, and often do manipulate those closest to them the most. Sometimes, if they are aware, They even pride themselves on their manipulative abilities. Next, we have fake humility as an outward behavior with corruptible ethics behind the facade. Grandiosity clashing with self-doubt and awareness of social norms creates an imitation of humility in many narcissists. They perceive themselves as well-reflected and socially aware, and particularly if they're very smart, which a lot of them are, they can be that, albeit with the focus remaining on them. They are likely to front a dishonest distaste for materialism, for example, and be enthusiastic about social causes, owed to the awareness that these will earn them the praise they desire because they are appreciated and lauded and wanted, encouraged things to do and be. Narcissists are therefore susceptible to changing their quote-unquote beliefs, at least, that which they portray to be their beliefs, rather effortlessly, depending on who they are trying to prove their superiority to. This does not mean that they're necessarily talking down to that person, but trying to demonstrate a moral superiority. They are, however, likely to rationalize ethically questionable decisions, both under their own ideals and objectively, if they serve their purpose. Accordingly, narcissists are often overly focused on their appearance, both visually and socially, but aim to be seen as effortlessly exceptional. Last point I will go into here is the juxtaposition of intellectualism with a lack of self-worth. This is basically another shell of an ideal that serves the purpose of appearing a certain way while not actually being all that interested in the actual thing behind it. Many narcissists are exceptionally eloquent, good with language in general, because language shapes and influences reality, and that can be very important, or usually is very important to narcissists. And they flaunt an above-average intellect, as well as a preference for languages. Like I said, they use language to balance their self-worth by verbally bending reality until it no longer threatens their self-image. So they might talk a lot and get a bit further away from what was actually said or asked or what actually happened with every little reiteration of what is being talked about, as one example. They also pride themselves on amassing knowledge or reading particularly hard-to-read books. They're often ambitious, determined, and tireless workers, but this too is largely motivated by expecting praise or even envy or wanting to create and attest to their brilliance. They want to make it provable, palpable, objective that they are especially good. Now, I know there's a lot of people who talk very definitely about what makes a narcissist happen, basically. And there might have been some developments that I'm not aware of, but last thing I read from multiple reputable sources, there is no conclusive data overall on what causes NPD or its lesser forms exactly. That doesn't mean we don't have any idea. Generally, genetics play an important role, as does the relationship with the parents in early childhood. Parents can cause narcissistic tendencies in their children in numerous ways, apart, of course, from a genetic predisposition that is heritable, unfortunately. Excessive, unwarranted praise and attention can do as much damage as excessive and unfair criticism or punishment or even abuse, as both lead to a warped sense of self-worth and an overestimation of personal relevance in non-personal matters. Just to be clear, an overestimation of personal relevance doesn't have to mean I always definitely think of myself as too important in a grandiose way. It can just as easily mean it is my fault when bad things happen because I'm always being blamed for things that I didn't even know were wrong. Alongside this, unpredictability and unclear consequences, boundaries, and rules also reinforce this unhealthy relationship, as does narcissistic behavior on account of the parents themselves, for example, manipulation, viewing and treating the child as part of the ego, etc., because all of this is extremely destabilizing to a child, makes them insecure, makes them feel unsafe, and hinders them in developing a sense of self and self-worth. An additional possible cause in the rise in narcissism in modern societies, besides, of course, maybe a rise in the diagnosis because of greater awareness of the symptoms, as is usually the case with these things, is the focus on self-fulfillment and success through innovation and self-realization, making the feeling of not being good enough a constant threat, more so than it maybe was in the past. With the groundwork laid, narcissism is not one of the central topics openly addressed in Gone Girl. However, its presence in both Amy and Nick is undeniable, though it is revealed to the reader only gradually. The unreliable narration of both first-person narrators demonstrates, yet at the same time often masks, Nick and Amy's narcissistic behavior. Because of this, in order to stay within the limitations of this paper, it was impossible to closely examine all instances of narcissistic thought, language, and narrated action recorded, as a vast majority of pages in the novel contain one to several utterances that might be worth considering. In fact, I do remember going through the book for the research for this paper and really marking one sentence at least on nearly every page of the novel. I will instead attempt to give an overview necessary to analyze the Dunn's relationship dynamic further on. Let's start with Amy. In the first part of the novel, Amy Elliott Dunn comes across as charming, intelligent, witty, self-aware and independent, a successful and driven woman, overall confident, but with a tendency for obsessive behavior and dramatics, though not uncharming. She's later revealed to be, in fact, cold, highly manipulative, controlling, exploitative, vengeful, and deeply unhappy. These two different images, the outward presentation that most people get to know as long as they don't get too close, starkly contrasting with her inner self, actual Amy, as she calls it, are an indicator of antisocial tendencies in general, but narcissism especially. Amy's entire personality, or rather the entirety of both of them, are defined by her narcissism. That is not to say that she isn't complex or that there are no redeeming qualities about her in either of those versions, but even most of those spring from her need to prove her worth to others, but also herself, while some are merely a mask. The first version of Amy that readers are introduced to is a mix of Nick's description of her and Diary Amy. Diary Amy, who, according to actual Amy, is a work of fiction, does come off as somewhat high-strung and also a bit narcissistic, but mostly to a non-pathological degree. She likes order, optimization, and predictability, as evidenced by her revisionist personality quizzes.
A, I'm an award-winning scrimshander. B, I'm a moderately influential warlord. C, I write personality quizzes for magazines.
Okay.
These also emphasize that she prides herself on being a writer and her eloquence. They are not real choices, but rather a display of her reflective capabilities and her wit. She shows a need for approval here and there, even while writing her diary, false humility in some instances, outright bragging and egocentrism in others, and specifically takes pride in what she considers exceptional about herself. In this, she also displays a noteworthy amount of self-reflection, though it can be selective and usually lacks empathy. The latter is especially noticeable in the way she talks about her friends. The few she does bring up seem unimportant, replaceable. Amy outright badmouths them for their way of life without even considering the validity of different perspectives than hers. This shows especially when she compares her relationship to others, bringing in the idealization that plays a central role in narcissism.
Promise me we'll never be like them.
Like who?
All those awful couples we know, those wives who treat their men like dancing monkeys.
She also shows some signs of fleeting and corruptible idealism, inconsistently painting herself a feminist while tearing down women and aspects of femininity that don't coincide with what she is or aspires to be.
The girl with the giant come-on-me tits.
I truly believed we were in love.
She looks like a fucking Mennonite.
The perspective Nick adds to this in part 1 hints at actual Amy and aids to complete the picture. His recounts further cement Amy's disliking of anything too modern or openly luxurious, her obsessive behavior and perfectionism, her superficial idealism and flimsy treatment of friends, despite being a social magnet. She is a tireless worker, and she shows clear signs of intellectualism, having, quote, an explanation for everything and a self-imposed obligation to, let's say, advance intellectually. He portrays her as holding grudges and having thin skin regarding potential personal attacks. Not only that, but she shows vengeful and contemptuous tendencies in his description, provoking situations that prove his unworthiness to her.
So is Amy gonna do one of those anniversary treasure hunts?
You mean the forced march designed to prove what an oblivious and uncaring asshole her husband is?
Wow.
She is also competitive and craves others' admiration or, better yet even, jealousy. Very likely a projection of her own envy. She treats him with noticeable selfishness and egocentrism. Interestingly, this is portrayed in not only Nick's recounts, but in a few instances both characters address, most notably the description of their first wedding anniversary. Amy omits anything that would paint an unfavorable picture of her or the relationship. Through this, parts of Nick's description of the events don't fit the image readers have of Diary Amy at that point. However, Nick does mention that Amy underwent a change during their relationship and describes her old self as someone very similar to Diary Amy, which allows for the assumption that she either is indeed not entirely made up after all, or that Nick simply went from being a superficial acquaintance, the sort of person that only gets to see the facade, to a person close enough to see the real Amy. Finally, then, there is actual Amy, who is first revealed at the beginning of part 2 of the novel.
I am so much happier now that I'm dead. And my lazy, lying, cheating, oblivious husband will go to prison for my murder. Nick Dunn took my pride and my dignity and my hope and my money. He took and took from me until I no longer existed. That's murder. Let the punishment fit the crime.
Where Diary Amy is conflicted and neurotic, actual Amy shows psychopathic traits. While Diary Amy struggles with the pressures she puts on herself, actual Amy takes pride in ridding herself of social imperatives. She's cold, hollow, she even admits to, quote, pretending to have a personality based on what fit the occasion or people she aimed to impress.
You befriend a local idiot. You need to package yourself so that people will truly mourn your loss. And America loves pregnant women. As if it's so hard to spread your legs. You want Nick and Amy to be likable. After that, you invent. The spending, the abuse, the fear, the threat of violence.
She talks about her childhood and her parents, saying she, quote, grew up feeling special, proud. Her parents did something particularly strange. They turned her into an idealized version of herself as the children's book character Amazing Amy. This astonishing decision could only reinforce this feeling in two ways, making her feel exceptional on the one hand.
Wait a minute. Your wife is Amazing Amy?
Yeah, she is.
While at the same time forever covertly criticizing her for not measuring up to every possible standard, not successfully taking every opportunity, not turning every opportunity into success, etc.
Perfect, brilliant, amazing Amy, who's getting fucking married.
When I was 10, I quit cello. In the next book, Amazing Amy became a prodigy.
You play volleyball?
I got cut freshman year. She made varsity.
Wow. I love your parents, but they really can be assholes.
This only reinforced her already pre-existing need to be perfect, as well as her superiority complex at the same time. A very distorting force for a young sense of self. Yet, she also felt threatened by her dead sisters because, quote, they get to be perfect without even trying. Well, she had to, quote, try, and every day was a chance to be less than perfect. Her pathological perfectionism is something she has kept alive actively until present day, and though she is aware it has made life harder for her, she prides herself on her thoroughness and brilliance and expects to be admired for it. This matches up with Nick's observations of her never doing anything spontaneously or unprepared. That especially goes for planning her disappearance. She goes into detail about her preparations, a year of planning ahead, writing the diary, manipulating her pregnant neighbor so she could use her urine, hurting herself without hesitation, even saving strands of her hair before she cuts it. This is a pattern that Nick discovers to have been present all her life. Throwing herself down a flight of stairs to set up her high school friend Hillary, by also exploiting her own parents, who disappointed her, and framing her ex-boyfriend Tommy for rape because he was losing interest in her.
She said I raped her. First-degree felony rape. Did you do it? Did you do it? Yeah.
Making another person's life about her by force, and they no longer fed her ego the way they were supposed to. Or have discovered too many parts of her real self. Hillary Handy sums it up as thus when Nick goes to talk to her. She was brilliant and charming and all that, but she was also controlling and OCD and a drama queen and a bit of a liar. She got rid of me because I knew she wasn't perfect. This long-established and practiced pattern climaxes with her plot against Nick, which was originally meant to end with him being executed for her murder and her killing herself to complete the perfect setup. Which, side note, even though she doesn't end up going through with it, shows just how committed, at least in theory, she was to making his life hell for not performing the way she expected him to, which she feels justified in because she feels entitled to him fitting that image. Something that also doesn't go as planned is that along the way, one of the plan's escalations is the unplanned murder of Desi, her ex-boyfriend, using him as just another chess piece, the ultimate attest to the absence of any empathy in her. She calls this, quote, discipline, another trait she takes pride in and considers exceptional about herself. Amy's need for competition, which is fueled by her obsessive, often projected envy of others, shows in a statement she makes about her relationship with Nick.
I forged the man of my dreams. And what's the point of being together if you're not the happiest?
This is the base of all her contempt and resentment towards him, as she blames him for their unhappiness, and its starting point seems to center around their first wedding anniversary. Now, regardless of how truthful the diary is in its details, Nick's retelling also points to this being the turning point for their relationship. Most notably, Amy's idea of what would be a romantic attest to their love proves to be stressful for Nick and much more about her than him, yet she insists on making it a tradition, a predictable occasion for her to be disappointed in him and for him to feel shamed, subpar.
A forced march designed to prove what an oblivious and uncaring asshole her husband is.
Wow.
Amy has the intelligence and the knowledge to be aware that this can only hurt their relationship, yet she refuses to give up on her idea of a perfect marriage. Egocentrism and a lack of empathy, idealized visions of love, contempt, manipulation, her obsessive tendencies, and a hunger for approval are all combined in this one forced tradition. She does not decide to frame him, however, until he cheats on her, and the main reason for it is not hurt feelings, but a hurt ego. In other words, narcissistic rage. Because his cheating reflects badly on her. Because it allows him to win. Because he is part of her identity, of her ego, and not performing as intended, making her seem foolish, not enough, dumb, not perfect. Summing all this up, we could say, Amy is a partially aware, superficially functioning narcissist. Most likely a result of genetics, definitely of her narcissistic parents' overly enchanted yet highly exploitative and heartbreakingly inconsiderate treatment of her. She takes no interest in others outside of siphoning off their admiration for her, be it open or in the form of jealousy, and proving to herself that she is better than them by some standard, which she refers to as winning. She views and treats those close to her as part of her ego and experiences intense narcissistic injury and rage when they do not perform their role as part of her self-image perfectly, which she then transforms into schemes to teach them a lesson. This is apparently a pattern that has been present in Amy's life since she was capable of it. She holds the world to her standards and mercilessly exacts punishment for inadequacy.
First thing you have to understand about Amy, she loves to teach lessons.
Play God.
Yeah, Old Testament God.
And now, since this is a fictional character, we're talking about, I feel comfortable making a diagnosis that is, that Amy likely suffers from NPD. However, a definite statement on this is hard to make, due of course to the novel's multiple layers of unreliable narration. With that being said, let's turn our sights to Nick. Nick's narcissism, though present, isn't as immediately apparent as Amy's, partly because in the narrated present, it mostly shows in reactions. He isn't a proactive, vengeful narcissist. Because Nick shows exploitative tendencies. He shows corruptible morality. He is easily swayed and manipulated by approval and admiration, and is himself capable of cold, manipulative behavior and bending reality. But while Amy presents as a grandiose to maybe even psychopathic narcissist, Nick is the usually vulnerable type that is tortured by self-doubt and suppressed negative emotions and a lot of shame. He constantly needs to counterbalance insecurities and self-doubt by making sure he's liked. He has completely externalized his self-worth. This, too, is spawned by an egocentric worldview. He relates everything to himself, and because of it, makes sure he is still somehow deserving of love, a trait he doesn't consider implicit. Meaning that, unlike in Amy, his egocentrism usually does not lead to him feeling exceptional or grandiose, but to a constant state of inner tension, of feeling like everything is his fault and just on the verge of making him need to feel intense shame again, and making it necessary for him to make up for something and explain. It also makes him vulnerable to criticism in an even more self-destructive way than Amy. While criticism makes Amy indignant and vengeful, it makes Nick compromise his principles and change his behavior drastically, regardless of what his actual opinion might be if he were even able to access it, just in order to please. Sometimes even preemptively. A prominent example of this is lying to his closest ally Go about his affair. He states his main reason as such, quote, "I was afraid you'd tell me to stop, that you'd think badly of me and then I'd have to stop." Instead of being truthful with the person he considers his closest ally right off the bat, and could once tell everything, but subsequently having to face a version of himself he can't stand to admit because this ally that acts as his moral compass, or rather his preservation of his self-worth, doesn't approve, he opts for knowingly hurting her, because that is the smaller price to pay. He also seems to bend reality with his words, make excuses, and lie quite regularly, not just to Amy, but almost pathologically. His self-worth is entirely dependent on others' opinion of him, hence his, quote, killer smile in stressful situations, his conviction that people generally just dislike him for the way he looks and that it is his responsibility to convince them otherwise. The first one of which probably isn't true, and the second definitely isn't. Now, of course, it could also just be viewed as a simple observation he has made throughout his life. It's likely that this is a projection of his own fear and inner conviction of not being good enough, not likable, inherently bad. This fear spawns his superficial, overzealous, yet dishonest adherence to authority, his suppression of any negative emotions, as well as the resulting inability to display them when appropriate. I should mention at this point that all this, of course, initially also makes him a lot more likable than Amy because, well, it is literally his goal not to upset anyone because that would threaten his ego. Inwardly, however, he harbors dangerous amounts of rage due to this suppression that he constantly carries out. He is often motivated by shame, and he is easily led to distrust even people he is close to, especially when those people are women. Nick even points that out several times himself, mentioning his father as the source of his misogyny.
Stupid, dumb, ugly bitch. Yes, stop.
Like he can't do anything about it. While he initially seems too harsh on himself in this regard, he eventually arrives at a point where he bends reality to make himself feel like the good guy. Against other indications of his slight to obvious misogyny, he decides that Amy is the only woman he holds a justified grudge against. In truth, however, he experiences gender-based resentment and contempt for several women throughout the book. Boney, Mary Beth, Andy, even Go, even the staff at his father's nursing home, to name a few. Nick also exhibits a worrying lack of concern and compassion for Amy. While it may be spawned by resentment and stress brought on by her behavior, he does not even seem to realize anything wrong with his entitled behavior until led to reflect on it by the police. His affair with Andy is, of course, the biggest indicator for this state of mind and callousness towards his wife. While the affair might be explained by his unhappiness and frustration brought on by the Duns' mutual toxicity towards each other, he nevertheless ignores his part in that state and completely disregards his wife's feelings. Additionally, his lack of empathy for Amy is not unprecedented at this point. It is also evidenced by moving her to Missouri, not even fully realizing that she would hate it, because he is incapable of seeing that, though it should have been obvious. Another point is taking the last of her money, the rest of her already limited independence and comfort from her, and then proceeding to neglect helping her integrate and feel at home, all for lack of caring and respect. His affair also brings up another noteworthy narcissistic behavior. Nick immediately decides to get rid of Andy once he notices that the affair has become more of a threat than he expected, on top of warming up to Amy again because of her letters. He does this rather coldly, trying to manipulate Andy into wanting to, quote, keep him safe, after claiming that he loves her not much earlier. He also ignores her completely until she makes the effort to seek him out in person. Again, there are outer circumstances that inspire this behavior, but he also doesn't try to at least comfort her via text, disregarding her feelings and her worry. It does not seem to fit the thought of, quote, really loving her. Contrary to his claim that this affair, or more drastically put, Andy herself, is more than an ego boost, that is exactly what she is. Because of this, the obvious manipulation in Amy's letters works just as she anticipated. Nick is so easily lulled into feeling what he calls love by being consoled and admired enough that part of him forgets what he knows Amy is making him go through, and blinds him to even the thought that the things he has discovered don't really go together. Now, Nick very clearly does not qualify for NPD, in my estimation. He is too socially and self-aware, he retains some empathy, and functions on both a social as well as a personal level, at least under normal circumstances. We should also take into account that his symptoms are most likely exacerbated and made worse by his relationship with Amy. However, he has enormous amounts of suppressed shame and anger brought on by externalizing self-love, spawned by his father's emotional abuse on one, and his mother and sister's overbearing care and love on the other end. Because of this, he suppresses any negative emotion for fear of losing control or displeasing people, betraying that he's not the person he wants to be and firmly believes he is not. This also makes him vulnerable to criticism, any kind of it, which he does not usually evaluate or fight, but instead immediately internalizes, feeding into his paranoia about everyone disliking him by default, and not questioning whether that is reasonable or even the reasons, so he can decide or evaluate whether it's fair that this criticism is being leveled against him, that he is being disliked, or whether he might even be able to change something if he himself thinks it's worth changing. That is something he cannot judge. He believes he is inherently dislikable and bad, and therefore any effort of changing it would be futile. Conversely, the same goes for admiration, praise, and approval, which, just like his wife, he sucks up without scrutiny. In his case, because he not only craves but depends on it to uphold his self-worth, since he believes he is inherently bad. Any chance of somebody not believing that is a short respite. Though he is, as mentioned, not without empathy, he does put his own needs before those of others, using exploitation if necessary. In this, he is usually not as aware as Amy of his manipulative behavior and rationalizes it by bending reality or only considering aspects that fit the version that does not threaten his self-worth. Nick may not be as advanced or upfront a narcissist as his wife, but he is noticeably outside of the normal spectrum. With narcissism being verifiably ingrained in both protagonists in different ways and to different degrees, the remaining question is if and why it also plays the lead role in how their marriage starts, deteriorates, and will always persist eventually. Nick married Amy because she fascinated him. She shares his interests, is intelligent, arguably brilliant even, challenges him, and is, on top of it, beautiful, a quality that he previously avoided out of his fear of seemingly flawless women. This is one way in which he devalues others to uphold his self-worth. With women, Nick does this either through deeming them unintelligent or dislikable, or, the variant he prefers, ugly. Ugly women don't threaten him because he perceives them as less womanly, i.e. less intimidating, even at times comforting, since he specifically points out that his sister is not particularly attractive. A woman that is seemingly flawless, indicated, interestingly enough, mostly and firstly, well, maybe the firstly is understandable, by their conventional visual attractiveness, is scary because he has nothing to latch on to in terms of somehow elevating himself above them so he doesn't have to crawl in the muck of believing that he is not worthy of anybody's positive feelings towards him. Amy, therefore, is probably right in suspecting that Nick most likely fell for her with the intensity that he did because she embodied his cool girl, whether she was actually just pretending to be that or really all she portrayed to be.
Nick loved a girl I was pretending to be. Cool girl. Men always use that, don't they, as their defining compliment. She's a cool girl. Cool girl is hot. Cool girl is game. Cool girl is fun. Cool girl never gets angry at her man. She only smiles in a chagrin-loving manner and then presents her mouth for fucking. She likes what he likes. When I met Nick Dunn, I knew he wanted cool girl. And for him, I'll admit, I was willing to try.
This is also the quintessential reason why a large amount of his love for her is actually narcissistic. He loves her as a representation and a mirror of traits he enjoys about himself or would like to think that he has. She is less important as a person from the very beginning than as what she stands for, as well as a confirmation that he is lovable by somebody flawless, nevertheless. Of course, the latter could be argued as an aspect that plays a role in all courtship, but the important detail here is the degree to which it plays a role. Because Amy is more relevant to Nick in her role as a source of externalized self-love than as a person, she becomes replaceable, even vital to replace, as soon as she no longer performs said role, which is where her perceived flawlessness also becomes part of, well, her downfall, so to say, because it reaffirms the constant shame and humiliation Nick puts on himself. Insidiously, this is also why Nick loses his respect for her when, to him, she seems to just stop being happy. As much as she needs him to perform in the perfect way that she feels entitled to, he expects her to keep serving his needs, because otherwise he has to lose respect for her in order not to lose respect for himself. Amy's reasons for courting and marrying Nick, unsurprisingly, are not any less selfish, however. She sees him as a perfect counterpart, falling in line with the old, questionable romanticism of feeling, quote, completed by another person. While Nick does not seem to assign any value to this, it is the main reason Amy is so set on him as a partner. She immediately sees him as her soulmate, largely because she sees no merit in anything, quote, less, since it would mean she would settle, a clear focus on what the relationship says about her rather than on her partner or the love between them. Because of this, she gears her permanent ideal image of him and their relationship solely to their first few months together. The perfect phase, where nothing goes wrong, where every relationship is perfect. Deeming him infallible, perfect, correct during those times, she extends her ego onto him in that period, risking serious narcissistic injury through him proving to be anything but what she has decided in that honeymoon period he has to be in order for her to be happy with him, and by extension herself for choosing him. It also closely hinges on her envy turned contempt for her parents' happy marriage and display of their perfect, quote, soulmate thing. Though she likes to portray herself as always being motivated by reason and calculation, she is set on her relationship, like everything about her, being perfect, eternal, incontestable. Succeeding at finding her perfect match means that she has, once again, won. She is right. She has done well. She is to be envied. To her, too, the marriage is about her ego first, before, well, if we can even say before it is about her partner, if it is about him at all. Nick is not relevant as an individual, but as a piece of her self-image that she crafts and constantly fights to uphold.
You can stop pretending now.
I'm not pretending. You are perfect. The Nick I saw on TV, that's the Nick I fell in love with.
You do know I was just telling you what you wanted to hear, right?
That's how well you know me. You know me in your marrow.
Which is why her behavior contradicts her own statement of wanting, quote, a man who calls me on my bullshit, yet also kind of likes my bullshit. Amy clearly is not a person who appreciates or is even capable of handling being caught in bad behavior, no matter who it comes from. The hidden truth in this is, of course, that if you assume you would allow somebody to call you on your bullshit, and they would, when they then don't do it, it is proof that you are perfect the way you are. Nick thereby serves to fulfill a fantasy, to enhance her, which is why she initially likes his casual, laid-back personality that so much contrasts with hers, until she discovers its flip side, less attention to detail and absent-mindedness, which she finds downright deplorable. This is typical idealization and contempt by bending reality. One of these sides is always ignored, even though they go together. She cannot appreciate or despise one without ignoring the other because it will call her self-worth into question in both cases. She didn't choose right. So her perception of reality must be right, and he changed. He owes her not to change. It remains questionable why the Dunns did not make the decision to separate before moving to Missouri, at the very least on the account of Amy, why they deluded themselves for as long as they did, and, most of all, why they still stay together after initially carelessly, then strategically making each other severely unhappy. The simple yet complicated answer is because Nick cannot and Amy will not be happy with anyone else. For Nick, Andy, his new love, is the best proof for this even before he fully realizes it himself, even apart from the whole very questionable, let's be diplomatic, teacher-student dynamic. He drops Andy as soon as he starts falling for Amy's flattery again and gets over her very quickly. This is not inappropriate in regards to how he treated her, but seems unusual nevertheless, particularly in connection with how he talked about his feelings, or supposed feelings, towards her. Beyond that, the explanation is presented to readers within the last few entries quite plainly. The less open aspect is, again, how narcissism factors into this. As Amy lays out, and Nick then realizes himself, Nick can't let Amy go because she knows him. She has figured him out. She knows how to press his buttons, and she, quote, cares enough to commit multiple crimes for, even against him, to keep him. Ordinarily, this should be the biggest possible warning sign, or red flag, as it were, even when put up against Amy's pregnancy and the threat she holds over his head. Instead, it ends up being what Nick uses to convince himself he actually needs to stay with Amy. He comes to the conclusion he will never be able to love anyone else because he would be left thinking, quote, "You've never framed me. You wouldn't even know how to begin to do what Amy did. You could never possibly care that much." He reframes Amy's actions as a positive, as an attest to her undying love for him. He is, once again, choosing the option that entails someone demonstrating their love and desire for him. The more dramatic, the better. The more desirable it makes him feel. The more special he is. The more worth pursuing. There's also another possible interpretation in line with Nick's narcissism and emotional history in particular. With his father recently having passed away, he no longer has an object to project his self-hatred onto, to root his shame, doubt, and blame in, to make this hollowness, this constant anxiety and humiliation inside of him make sense somehow that has nothing to do with him intrinsically, but rather with an outside source. The emptiness he feels instead of the relief he expected could very possibly be a first sign of grief. It could, however, also hint at the realization that he will no longer have a negative example to directly contrast himself with. Unless he stays with Amy, his, quote, forever antagonist, his ultimate negative example of character. As an extremer extension of his externalized self-love, it is also possible that he slowly has projected his entire sense of self onto other people, such as Go, his parents, and, above all, Amy. He relates to himself, to his personality and identity, merely by comparing and contrasting himself to others. He cannot push himself to be, quote, good when he is not externally motivated by a positive example or, more easily, an example of what he is trying to avoid becoming and can feel superior to. This is the function his father served for decades. With him gone, and with all of Amy's dark sides having come out recently, making her less perfect, Nick transfers this role onto her, making it highly risky, if not impossible, to cut her out of his life. Because she is now inextricably linked to his sense of self. She truly has become his, quote, pulse in this sense. Amy, again, while possibly capable of finding her version of happiness, whatever that would mean, with another person, refuses to even consider the option because she needs to believe in the idea of soulmates. Because if she doesn't, then that means there is no perfect ideal to achieve. And she needs that perfect ideal so she can fulfill it, so she can feel superior. She therefore has to believe that Nick is her soulmate because she picked him, and she can't have picked wrong, which means leaving or losing him would cause a permanent, irreparable fault in her perfection, making her admit defeat in a long time, hard, frustrating project, not winning. She needs him to stay to avoid becoming less than, the sort of less than happy couples like her parents or some of her New York friends who she so bitterly envies, and because she cannot endure feeling that looks down upon. His feelings on the matter are irrelevant in this, because in her mind, she is following an impeccable string of logic, and she is always right, so if he doesn't agree, he must just be made to understand. As long as he does not agree with the result, he simply has not yet taken on the correct perspective, that is, her perspective. She even has a perfect rationalization, of course, for why Nick and her are soulmates. Quote, Nick and I fit together. I'm a little too much, and he's a little too little. I'm a thorn bush, bristling from the overattention of my parents, and he is a man of a million little fatherly stab wounds, and my thorns fit perfectly into them. Most likely, though, the answer is simpler. Since Amy is infallible, the fact that she picked Nick must mean he is her soulmate, which reinforces the decision, which confirms he is her soulmate and makes it necessary that they stay together, repeat ad nauseum. A fault in any part of this would hence entail the downfall of the foundation of Amy's self-worth, self-image, her own perfection, which is precisely why she can't allow her marriage to fail through anything other than death. You could argue she's being a traditionalist. So, both of the Duns are victims of delusions. Amy, to the characteristic narcissistic notion that rules don't apply to her, that because she does things for a reason, or simply because she is Amy, she deserves special treatment, she deserves praise, she deserves the last word. While Nick has shortcomings, as it were, she has quirks. They were perfect until he stopped trying. As mentioned above, the starting point for this was most likely their first wedding anniversary. Nick believes that he can and will, quote, bring her down, that he is, quote, the hero who needs to stop Amy after supposedly having created her. Conveniently, in a bout of grandiose hubris, he ignores the roles of genetics, her upbringing, even her own agency, and, to a lesser degree, Desi. Above all else, though, he eventually accepts that she has won the game for the moment, which is also what his, by then only recently bygone, rage resulted from. In the end, what he is furious about, enough to want to kill Amy, is not the danger she put him in, or the callousness of her whole plot, but the fact that he was not able to outplay her, win, that no matter how well he played the game, she always had him beat. Conversely, this results in a sick newfound respect for her, the lack of which arguably was the main component in what drove her to the measures she took. Nick says it himself. He cannot stop because he is, quote, getting so much better at it, with it being her game. Neither of them stops to wonder what they are trying to achieve or win when it should be clear that they are doomed to keep losing. But that is not the point. They have discovered everything about each other, and it makes both of them feel more connected and in control of their, quote, toxic Mobius strip of a relationship. As Go puts it, they are, quote, addicted to each other, to the stalemate in taking each other's livelihoods hostage, the mix of mutual contempt and proud admiration, because seeing the other go to extremes, as well as feeling like they have figured each other out, finding imperfections, taking credit for each other's twistedness, means that they are exceptional, understood, but simultaneously entitled to focus on themselves. You have treated me so badly that I do not need to consider you anymore. This is a sort of twisted comfort no healthy person could ever offer them. They are right in that. And perhaps it is therefore actually fitting when Amy says, our kind of love can go into remission, but it's always waiting to return, like the world's sweetest cancer. As a final note, narcissism is, of course, not the only viable explanation for the Dunn's treatment of each other and of the people around them. In fact, there is merit to the notion that a lot of the things Amy and Nick do to each other is merely an exaggerated, even satirical version of most relationships. The polished persona during courtship, the manipulation, the resentment, the refusal to break up even though everything that was once working and beautiful is gone, twisted, and poisoned.
Yes, I loved you, and then all we did was resent each other and try to control each other and cause each other pain.
That's marriage.
Gone Girl allows for many interpretations, based partly on its two opposed, unreliable as well as factually and habitually manipulative narrators, and offers room for many psychological as well as other approaches based on the fact alone that every reader will relate strongly to different aspects and passages owed to their own experience and psyche and interests. Nevertheless, I believe narcissism, which could be evidenced and dissected even more thoroughly in a longer piece of work, to remain a very likely to even obvious explanation for what sets the groundwork for many of these escalations of familiar patterns. And so Amy and Nick are intertwined in their everlasting and ever-growing toxicity. And if we were to take them as anything other than a fictional couple, they might actually be doing the world a favor by keeping each other hostage. This has been one of my papers.